The basement of the Holiday Bar on Madison Street was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of old beer soaked into concrete. Joseph Pistone sat across from Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero at a card table that had seen better decades, a single bulb hanging overhead, casting shadows across Lefty's weathered face. Between them sat a velvet-wrapped bundle that Pistone had just opened to reveal 6 diamond rings that caught the light like captured stars. Lefty picked up one ring, turned it slowly under the bulb, his experienced eyes scanning for flaws, while his other hand rested near the snub-nosed revolver tucked into his waistband. This moment, September 1976, represented 18 months of groundwork, hundreds of lies, and the culmination of an FBI operation that would either crack open the Bonanno crime family or get Joseph Pistone killed in this basement where no one would hear him scream. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been trying to penetrate the American Mafia for decades with limited success. Traditional investigative techniques like wiretaps and informants provided surface-level intelligence, but rarely reached into the inner workings of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York. The Mafia's structure, built on blood ties, ethnic loyalty, and a code of silence called omertà, created barriers that conventional law enforcement struggled to overcome. Informants were rare because cooperation meant death, not just for the informant, but potentially for their entire family. Wiretaps captured conversations but missed the relationship dynamics, the unspoken hierarchies, and the face-to-face meetings where actual decisions got made. By the mid-1970s, FBI Director Clarence Kelly pushed for a new approach: long-term undercover infiltration by agents willing to disappear into false identities for years, gathering evidence from inside the organization. The idea was revolutionary and dangerous, requiring agents to commit crimes, associate with murderers, and maintain lies so consistently that a single slip could mean death. Joseph Pistone seemed an unlikely candidate for such an operation. Born in 1939 in Erie, Pennsylvania, to working-class Italian-American parents, he grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, surrounded by the culture he would eventually infiltrate. He joined the FBI in 1969 after serving in the Navy, working initially on truck hijacking cases that brought him into contact with organized crime's economic activities. He was fluent in Italian, understood the cultural nuances of Italian-American neighborhoods, and possessed a psychological trait the FBI valued above all others in undercover work: the ability to lie convincingly without exhibiting the physiological stress responses that experienced criminals could detect. During his first undercover assignments in the early 1970s, posing as a burglar and a truck hijacker, Pistone demonstrated an uncanny capacity to inhabit false identities completely, never breaking character even under intense scrutiny. His handlers noticed that he didn't just pretend to be a criminal, he thought like one, anticipated their suspicions, and adjusted his behavior with an instinctive understanding of their psychology. The operation that would become known as Donnie Brasco began in July 1975 with a simple premise. Pistone would pose as a small-time jewel thief and burglar working the East Coast, establishing credentials in criminal circles until he could engineer an introduction to made members of the Mafia. The FBI created an elaborate legend: Donald Brasco, nicknamed Donnie, an experienced thief with contacts in Miami, a loner who avoided attention, and someone skilled enough to be valuable, but not so successful that his background would attract detailed scrutiny. They provided him with a criminal history, arrest records in California under the Brasco name that were actually FBI fabrications, planted in police databases, references from actual criminals who had been turned into informants and agreed to vouch for Brasco if contacted, and an apartment in Manhattan's Little Italy, the heart of Bonanno family territory. Pistone moved into that apartment alone, leaving behind his wife and 3 daughters in New Jersey, telling them he was going deep undercover for what the FBI estimated would be 6 months, perhaps a year at most. The first year was slow, tedious work that tested Pistone's patience and his marriage. He spent his days and nights in bars, social clubs, and restaurants frequented by criminals, establishing himself as Donnie Brasco, the jewel thief. He couldn't make arrests or stop crimes without blowing his cover, which meant watching hijackings, robberies, and assaults happen while doing nothing. He participated in the fencing of stolen goods, not as an FBI agent gathering evidence, but as Donnie Brasco establishing his criminal credentials. He drank with truck hijackers, played cards with bookmakers, and slowly built a reputation as someone reliable, someone who didn't talk too much, someone who could move stolen jewelry without attracting police attention. The isolation was psychological torture. He couldn't contact his family except through elaborate security protocols, couldn't visit them or acknowledge their existence when he was in character, and lived every moment knowing that a background check, thorough enough to crack his FBI-manufactured legend, would result in his execution. The break came in early 1976 through a small-time operator named Anthony Mira, a soldier in the Bonanno family known for his violent temper and his involvement in narcotics trafficking. Mira frequented a bar in Manhattan where Pistone had become a regular, and one night struck up a conversation about jewelry. Pistone, as Donnie Brasco, mentioned that he specialized in moving high-end stones, could evaluate quality, and had connections in Miami for distribution. Mira was interested because he occasionally acquired stolen jewelry through his criminal network, but lacked expertise to assess value or trusted contacts to fence items for fair prices. Over several weeks, they conducted small transactions, Pistone buying stolen rings and watches from Mira, paying fair prices, and demonstrating expertise that impressed the mobster. Mira began introducing Donnie around, bringing him to a social club on Madison Street where Bonanno associates gathered, vouching for him as a good guy, knows jewelry, keeps his mouth shut. It was at that social club in May 1976 that Pistone met Benjamin Ruggiero, the encounter that would define the next 6 years of his life. Lefty Ruggiero was 54 years old, a soldier in the Bonanno family who had spent decades in organized crime without achieving the wealth or status he believed he deserved. He was a degenerate gambler who perpetually owed money, a mediocre earner in an organization that valued earning above almost everything else, and a man haunted by a sense that life had cheated him despite his loyalty to the family. He wore expensive clothes bought on credit, drove a car he couldn't afford, and maintained the appearance of success while quietly drowning in debt. When Mira introduced Donnie Brasco as a jewel expert, Lefty saw opportunity. Someone with specialized skills could help him earn, pull off bigger scores, and maybe finally achieve the financial security that had eluded him for half a century. Lefty approached the relationship with a mixture of hope and suspicion that was typical of his personality. He tested Donnie constantly during their early interactions, asking questions designed to catch inconsistencies, checking whether Donnie's expertise was genuine, and watching for signs that he might be an informant or undercover agent. Pistone navigated these tests carefully, using his FBI training and his natural ability to read people. When Lefty showed him jewelry, Pistone evaluated it accurately, using knowledge gained from FBI experts and demonstrating a professional competence that criminals respected. When Lefty asked about his past, Pistone provided details from his legend that were specific enough to seem real, but vague enough to avoid verification. Arrests in California, time spent in Miami, family connections he didn't like to discuss. The key was consistency and confidence. Pistone never hesitated, never corrected himself, and never showed the nervousness that might indicate deception. The relationship deepened through small shared experiences that built trust incrementally. Lefty invited Donnie to dinner at restaurants in Little Italy, where they sat for hours discussing everything from jewelry to gambling to Lefty's frustrations with the Mafia hierarchy. Pistone learned that Lefty was bitter about made members who earned less than him, but enjoyed higher status because of family connections or political alliances within the organization. He learned that Lefty had a son who was a heroin addict, a source of shame and heartbreak that Lefty rarely discussed, but that informed his cynical worldview. He learned that despite decades in organized crime, Lefty still believed in the Mafia's mythology, the idea that loyalty and respect mattered more than money, even as his own experience contradicted that belief. Pistone used this psychological insight, positioning himself as someone who valued loyalty, who didn't undercut partners, and who understood that respect was earned through reliability rather than flashy displays. By August 1976, Lefty had essentially adopted Donnie as a protege and potential partner. He brought Donnie to meetings with other Bonanno associates, introducing him as a friend of mine, a phrase that in Mafia culture signaled that Donnie was vouched for and under Lefty's protection. He involved Donnie in criminal activities beyond jewelry fencing, including bookmaking operations, loan sharking collections, and discussions about potential hijackings. Most significantly, Lefty began teaching Donnie the culture and rules of the Mafia, explaining the hierarchy from street-level associates up through soldiers, captains, and the boss, describing the rituals of initiation for made members, and outlining the expectations and obligations that governed relationships within the family. For Pistone, this was intelligence gold. He was receiving an education in Mafia operations from a lifelong member who trusted him enough to explain things that outsiders never saw. The FBI was ecstatic with the progress, but increasingly nervous about the risks. Pistone's handlers met him every few weeks in carefully orchestrated encounters, usually in hotel rooms or safe houses outside Manhattan, where he would debrief about his interactions and receive guidance for navigating increasingly complex situations. They provided him with stolen jewelry to maintain his cover as a fence, items that were actually FBI property, or goods recovered from unrelated cases that could be used without legal complications. They coached him on how to handle situations where Lefty or others might propose crimes that Pistone couldn't legally participate in without crossing lines that would jeopardize the investigation or his safety. The challenge was maintaining criminal credibility while avoiding actual serious crimes. Pistone could fence stolen property and participate in gambling operations because those activities were necessary for the cover, but murder, major drug deals, or violent crimes were off limits, requiring Pistone to develop excuses that wouldn't arouse suspicion. That basement meeting in September 1976, with the diamond ring spread on the velvet cloth, was Lefty's test of whether Donnie could be trusted with bigger operations. Lefty had acquired the rings through a burglary crew he worked with, and needed them fenced quickly before the theft was discovered, and police started watching known channels for stolen jewelry. He chose to involve Donnie because the FBI agent had proven reliable in smaller transactions, but this was different. The value was higher, the risk greater, and the transaction would determine whether Lefty brought Donnie deeper into the family's operations. Pistone examined each ring carefully, aware that Lefty was watching not just his evaluation of the jewelry, but his demeanor, his confidence, his reactions. He knew that undervaluing the rings would suggest he was trying to cheat Lefty, while overvaluing them would reveal inexperience. He quoted fair prices based on what he knew a fence could realistically get, then offered to take the entire lot and have money ready within 2 days. Lefty's face relaxed in a way that Pistone had learned to recognize as approval. The older man pocketed the rings, nodded slowly, and then said something that made Pistone's pulse quicken, despite years of training to control physiological responses. "You know, Donnie, I'm thinking maybe it's time to talk to some people about you, about making you part of something bigger." The implication was clear. Lefty was considering proposing Donnie for membership in the Bonanno family, an outcome that would give the FBI unprecedented access to the organization's inner workings. Pistone responded cautiously, expressing gratitude while not appearing too eager, saying he'd be honored, but understood these things took time, and he'd continue proving himself however Lefty needed. He left the Holiday Bar that night knowing the operation had reached a critical juncture. He was no longer just an undercover agent gathering peripheral intelligence, but someone on the path to becoming a made member of the Mafia, a position no FBI agent had ever achieved. The personal cost of the operation was escalating in ways Pistone hadn't anticipated when he started. His marriage was disintegrating under the strain of his absence and the psychological toll of his double life. His wife knew he was undercover, but not the details, living with the knowledge that her husband was somewhere in Manhattan pretending to be a criminal, exposed to dangers he couldn't discuss and couldn't protect himself from without blowing his cover. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, and school events for his daughters, watching them grow up through brief, awkward visits that had to be carefully scheduled to avoid compromising his identity. When he did see his family, he found it increasingly difficult to transition back into being Joseph Pistone. Donnie Brasco's mannerisms, speech patterns, and psychological defenses had become so ingrained that his real personality felt like the performance. He started having dreams where he couldn't remember which identity was genuine, waking up in his Little Italy apartment, unsure whether he was an FBI agent pretending to be a criminal or a criminal having nightmares about being someone else. If you're still watching this story of a man who disappeared into a lie so deep it almost consumed him, if you believe that some investigations demand sacrifices most people can't imagine, go ahead and like this video and comment the word "infiltrate" below. Let's see how many of us understand that the line between hunter and hunted sometimes disappears completely. Through late 1976 and into 1977, Pistone's integration into the Bonanno family accelerated. Lefty brought him to the Motion Lounge, a bar in Brooklyn that served as a headquarters for the crew run by Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, a captain in the family known for his intelligence and ambition. Sonny Black was everything Lefty wasn't: successful, respected, and politically connected within the organization's hierarchy. He was involved in major operations, including labor racketeering on the Brooklyn waterfront, narcotics distribution, and coordination with other crime families. When Lefty introduced Donnie to Sonny Black, he emphasized Donnie's expertise with jewelry and his reliability, positioning him as an asset who could help the crew earn. Sonny Black was less sentimental than Lefty, evaluating Donnie with the cold assessment of someone who had survived decades in organized crime by trusting carefully and eliminating threats ruthlessly. Sonny Black's approval came through tests that were more sophisticated than Lefty's. He gave Donnie assignments that required demonstrating not just expertise, but judgment and discretion, the qualities that separated valuable associates from liabilities who would eventually bring police attention. He sent Donnie to evaluate jewelry from a robbery, then checked Donnie's assessment against his own expert, finding them identical and thus confirming competence. He included Donnie in conversations about crew business, watching whether Donnie repeated things he shouldn't, or showed too much curiosity about details that didn't concern him. He introduced Donnie to other MAID members, observing how Donnie interacted, whether he showed appropriate deference to hierarchy while maintaining self-respect. Pistone navigated these tests using psychological principles from his FBI training, mirroring Sonny Black's communication style, never volunteering information unnecessarily, and demonstrating the calm competence that criminals valued because it suggested someone who wouldn't panic under pressure. By mid-1977, Donnie Brasco was effectively a member of Sonny Black's crew, participating in daily operations and earning money that the FBI documented meticulously for future prosecution. Pistone was present for discussions about fixing Union elections on the waterfront, for meetings where loan sharking territories were divided among crew members, and for planning sessions about hijacking operations targeting trucks carrying electronics and cigarettes. He watched bookmaking operations process thousands of dollars in bets each week, observed how protection rackets extracted payments from legitimate businesses, and learned how money moved through the organization from street-level operations up through captains to the family's administration. Every conversation, every transaction, every revealed detail went into reports that Pistone delivered to his FBI handlers, building a comprehensive map of the Bonanno family's structure and operations. The psychological complexity of his situation deepened as genuine relationships formed within the lies. Lefty, in particular, became someone Pistone couldn't simply categorize as a target. The older mobster treated Donnie like a son, offering advice about life, sharing meals, and expressing hopes that Donnie would achieve the success that had eluded Lefty himself. He bought Donnie presents, loaned him money when Donnie claimed to be short, and defended him in disputes with other crew members who were jealous of the attention Sonny Black was giving the new associate. Lefty's affection was genuine, born from loneliness, and the dream that mentoring Donnie might finally give his life meaning beyond the disappointments and debts. Pistone found himself liking Lefty despite knowing that the evidence he was gathering would destroy the man's life, send him to prison, and likely result in the Mafia killing him for bringing a federal agent into the family. The operation's scope expanded beyond the Bonanno family as Pistone's reputation spread through New York's criminal underworld. His expertise with jewelry made him valuable to criminals from other families who needed items evaluated or fenced. The FBI authorized him to work with these outside contacts, seeing opportunities to gather intelligence on multiple crime families simultaneously. Pistone met with members of the Colombo family discussing a hijacking operation, sat down with Gambino associates about moving stolen bearer bonds, and was introduced to criminals in Florida's burgeoning cocaine trade who wanted to establish distribution networks in New York. Each interaction required careful FBI oversight. Agents had to monitor Pistone's safety while documenting evidence that could be used in prosecutions, all while ensuring that Pistone didn't become so deeply involved in criminal activities that his testimony would be compromised. In 1978, the operation faced its most dangerous moment when tensions within the Bonanno family erupted into violence that threatened to expose Pistone or get him killed in the crossfire. The family's boss, Philip Rusty Rastelli, was in prison, and a power struggle developed between factions supporting different candidates to run the family in his absence. Sonny Black aligned with a faction that opposed Dominic "Sonny Red" Indelicato, a captain who controlled crews in the Bronx and had ambitions to take control permanently. The dispute involved money, territory, and personal animosities that had festered for years, creating a situation where violence became inevitable. Lefty explained to Donnie that when disputes between captains couldn't be resolved politically, the family's administration authorized hits to eliminate one faction, maintaining order through the threat of death for those who challenged authority. Pistone reported the escalating tensions to his FBI handlers, who faced a dilemma. If they intervened to prevent murders, they would reveal that someone inside the family was providing information, potentially exposing Pistone and ending the operation. If they didn't intervene, people would die, creating legal and ethical problems for an FBI operation that was supposed to gather evidence, not facilitate homicides. The decision came from FBI headquarters. The operation would continue, with agents monitoring situations closely and prepared to intervene only if Pistone's life was directly threatened. The moral weight of that decision settled on Pistone, who knew that maintaining his cover meant allowing crimes to occur that he could potentially prevent. He rationalized it by focusing on the larger goal, telling himself that the evidence being gathered would eventually dismantle the entire organization and prevent far more crimes than those he witnessed while undercover. The violence came in May 1981 when Sonny Black's faction lured Sonny Red Indelicato and two of his captains to a meeting in Brooklyn with the promise of resolving their disputes. Pistone was not present for the murders, but he heard about them immediately afterward when Lefty arrived at his apartment pale and shaken, describing how the three captains had been shot and their bodies disposed of in a location that would send a message to their supporters. Lefty's hands trembled as he spoke, not from guilt, but from fear. He knew that Sonny Black's move was risky, that if the family's imprisoned boss disapproved, everyone involved could be marked for death themselves. Pistone documented every detail Lefty revealed, information that would later prove crucial in prosecuting the murders, while simultaneously managing Lefty's emotional state, reassuring him that Sonny Black had made the right strategic move and that they would be protected by having aligned with the winning faction. The aftermath of the murders elevated Sonny Black's status within the family and, by extension, improved Pistone's position. Sonny Black was promoted to captain, taking control of territories and operations that had belonged to the murdered rivals. He rewarded crew members who had supported him, giving them larger cuts of profits and greater responsibilities within the organization. For Donnie Brasco, this meant deeper involvement in major operations and proximity to decision-making at higher levels of the family. Sonny Black began including Donnie in meetings with other families' representatives, discussions about coordinating criminal activities across organizational boundaries, and planning for operations that involved significant money and risk. Pistone was now attending sit-downs where capos from different families negotiated territorial boundaries and resolved disputes, gatherings that gave him visibility into the Commission's role in governing organized crime. By 1981, Pistone had been undercover for 6 years, far beyond the FBI's initial estimates. The evidence he had gathered was massive: thousands of hours of recorded conversations, detailed documentation of criminal operations, and testimony that could support prosecutions of over 100 made members and associates. His FBI handlers were pushing to end the operation, concerned that the longer it continued, the greater the risk of exposure, or that Pistone would be forced into a situation where he'd have to participate in a serious violent crime to maintain his cover. But Pistone argued for continuation, believing he was on the verge of the ultimate achievement, being formally initiated as a made member of the Bonanno family, which would provide unprecedented insight into the Mafia's most secret rituals and inner workings. The FBI reluctantly agreed to extend the operation, setting July 1981 as the absolute deadline for extraction. The proposal for Donnie Brasco's initiation came from Sonny Black in June 1981, presented as recognition for 6 years of loyalty and valuable service. Sonny Black told Donnie that he had discussed the matter with the family's administration, that they had approved conducting background checks, and that assuming everything checked out, Donnie would be proposed for membership at the next available ceremony. Pistone's response was carefully calibrated excitement, expressing gratitude while internally calculating the impossibility of his FBI-manufactured legend surviving the kind of detailed background investigation that preceded initiation. The Mafia would check with criminal contacts in California about the arrests on Donnie's record, would seek confirmation from associates in Miami about his claimed activities there, and would interview criminals who knew him to assess whether anything about his story raised suspicions. The FBI had prepared for this contingency, maintaining the infrastructure of lies that supported Donnie's identity, but Pistone knew that the more scrutiny applied, the greater the chance someone would notice an inconsistency. The background check began, and Pistone lived each day knowing it might be his last if someone discovered the truth. He maintained his routines, continuing to fence jewelry, collect loan sharking debts, and participate in crew operations as if nothing had changed. Internally, he was preparing for multiple scenarios: what he would do if the Mafia discovered he was an agent, how he would signal the FBI that he needed immediate extraction, and what escape routes he could use from various locations in Manhattan and Brooklyn. The FBI positioned surveillance teams near him constantly, ready to intervene if he gave the distress signal or if they detected that his cover had been compromised. His wife and daughters were moved to a safe location under assumed names, protected in case the Mafia retaliated against his family. The revelation came not from the background check, but from a source no one had anticipated. In late June 1981, an FBI agent in another division was arrested for selling information to the Mafia, and during his interrogation, questions arose about whether he had compromised any ongoing operations. The investigation discovered that the corrupt agent had access to general information about undercover operations, though not specific details about Pistone's identity. FBI leadership made the decision that the risk of exposure was now too high. Even if the corrupt agent hadn't specifically identified Donnie Brasco, the Mafia would now be looking for FBI infiltration, increasing scrutiny on all recent associates and making Pistone's position untenable. The order came down: extract Pistone immediately, end the operation, and begin preparing arrests based on the evidence already gathered. Pistone's final days as Donnie Brasco were disorienting, a rushed dismantling of an identity he had inhabited for 6 years. He met with Lefty and Sonny Black, making excuses about needing to go to Florida to deal with a personal situation, promising to return within a week. Lefty was disappointed, mentioning that the background check was nearly complete and that they were close to scheduling Donnie's initiation ceremony. Pistone looked at the older man's hopeful face, knowing this was goodbye, that the next time Lefty heard about Donnie Brasco, it would be in the context of FBI arrests and the realization that his protege had been a federal agent all along. They shook hands, Lefty told Donnie to be safe, and Pistone walked out of the motion lounge for the last time, feeling the weight of the betrayal he was about to inflict on someone who genuinely cared about him. On July 26, 1981, FBI agents executed coordinated arrests targeting the Bonanno family leadership and soldiers based on evidence gathered during Operation Donnie Brasco. More than 100 mobsters were arrested in New York, Florida, and California, charged with crimes ranging from racketeering to murder, conspiracy, loan sharking, and gambling operations. The indictments detailed 6 years of criminal activity documented by FBI agent Joseph Pistone, whose undercover work was now revealed publicly for the first time. Media coverage was immediate and massive, with newspapers running stories about the FBI agent who had spent 6 years inside the Mafia, becoming so deeply embedded that he was about to be initiated as a made member before his extraction. The operation was hailed as the most successful organized crime investigation in FBI history, providing evidence that would dismantle the Bonanno family's leadership and demonstrate that the Mafia's code of silence could be penetrated through long-term undercover work. For Lefty Ruggiero, the revelation was devastating in ways that transcended legal consequences. He was arrested at his home, initially confused about the charges until FBI agents explained that Donnie Brasco was an undercover agent and that every conversation, every crime, every confidence Lefty had shared was documented evidence. The emotional impact was visible on Lefty's face in the arrest photographs, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and the realization that his judgment had failed catastrophically. Within the Mafia, bringing a federal agent into the family was an unforgivable violation that typically resulted in execution. Lefty knew that even if he avoided conviction in court, the Bonanno family would likely kill him for the breach of security that had exposed the organization's operations and led to the arrest of over 100 members and associates. Sonny Black Napolitano faced an even more direct consequence. As the captain who had elevated Donnie Brasco within the organization and given him access to sensitive operations, Sonny Black bore responsibility for the infiltration in the Mafia's eyes. On August 17, 1981, less than a month after the arrests, Sonny Black was summoned to a meeting by the family's leadership. He knew what the summons meant. Associates saw him remove his jewelry and leave it with his girlfriend, telling her quietly that if he didn't come back, she should keep it. He walked into that meeting and was never seen alive again. His body was discovered months later, hands severed to symbolize his failure to prevent the FBI infiltration, a message to anyone else who might compromise the organization's security. Pistone entered witness protection after the arrests. His identity changed. His location kept secret from everyone except his FBI handlers. His wife and daughters joined him in this new hidden existence, living under assumed names in an undisclosed location, severed from friends, extended family, and any connection to their previous lives. The psychological adjustment was brutal for all of them. After 6 years of Pistone living as Donnie Brasco, the family now had to adapt to life as completely different people, constantly aware that contracts on Joseph Pistone's life meant that discovery would result in the Mafia killing not just him, but potentially his entire family. His daughters grew up unable to discuss their real history, their father's career, or the reasons they had to move and change identities. His marriage, already strained by the undercover operation, eventually ended, another casualty of the choices required by the investigation. The legal proceedings resulting from Operation Donnie Brasco stretched across years, with trials prosecuting various aspects of the criminal activities Pistone had documented. His testimony was central to dozens of cases, requiring him to appear in court repeatedly under heavy security, facing defendants who included people he had known intimately for 6 years. He testified about murders, describing how Lefty had told him about the killing of the 3 captains, providing details that helped secure convictions. He explained the organizational structure of the Bonanno family, describing the hierarchy from street associates up through the administration, educating juries about how the Mafia functioned. He authenticated recordings and documents, confirming the identities of voices on wiretaps and explaining the context of conversations that seemed innocuous but actually discussed criminal activities in coded language. The convictions were substantial and historic, effectively decimating the Bonanno family's leadership. Dozens of MAID members received sentences ranging from decades to life imprisonment, based on evidence that detailed their involvement in murder conspiracies, racketeering enterprises, and ongoing criminal operations. The testimony demonstrated patterns of criminal activity that met the standards for RICO prosecutions, allowing federal prosecutors to charge entire networks rather than isolated crimes. The legal precedents established through these cases shaped how organized crime would be prosecuted for decades afterward, validating the FBI's investment in long-term undercover operations and demonstrating that penetrating the Mafia's code of silence was possible through patient, methodical infiltration. Lefty Ruggiero, facing multiple life sentences, accepted a plea agreement that acknowledged his cooperation in not resisting prosecution and his provision of some corroborating information about Bonanno family operations. He received a reduced sentence of 15 years, avoiding the murder conspiracy charges that would have kept him imprisoned until death. The Mafia did not kill him, surprisingly, perhaps because his prosecution and imprisonment were punishment enough, or perhaps because he was seen as more victim than perpetrator of the infiltration, manipulated by an FBI agent skilled in deception. He served his sentence quietly, a broken man who rarely discussed Donnie Brasco and the betrayal that had destroyed his life. He died in 1994, having never fully recovered from the realization that the person he had trusted most had been lying to him every moment of their 6-year relationship. Joseph Pistone eventually emerged from complete anonymity, writing a book about his experiences that became the basis for the film Donnie Brasco, starring Johnny Depp and Al Pacino. The public recognition was ironic. He had spent 6 years hiding his true identity to become Donnie Brasco, then spent years in witness protection hiding his true identity to survive, and finally became publicly known for the undercover work that had required absolute secrecy. He spoke at FBI training sessions, teaching new agents about the psychological demands of deep cover work, the techniques for maintaining false identities, and the personal costs that came with operations requiring years of separation from family and self. He acknowledged in interviews that he sometimes still thought of himself as Donnie Brasco, that the identity he had inhabited for 6 years had become part of his psychological makeup in ways he couldn't completely separate from who Joseph Pistone was. The broader impact of Operation Donnie Brasco extended beyond the specific prosecutions and convictions. It shattered the Mafia's confidence that their culture of silence and ethnic loyalty made them impenetrable to law enforcement. Families became paranoid about new associates, implementing more rigorous background checks and limiting what information was shared with non-made members. The operation demonstrated that FBI agents could successfully inhabit criminal identities for extended periods, leading the Mafia to suspect infiltration in multiple organizations and creating internal tensions that undermined trust. Some scholars argue that Operation Donnie Brasco marked the beginning of the American Mafia's decline, not because it destroyed the organization through arrests, but because it destroyed the psychological foundation of invulnerability and secrecy that had allowed the Mafia to operate openly for decades. The operation also sparked debates within law enforcement about the ethics and costs of deep undercover work. Critics questioned whether 6 years was too long for any agent to maintain a false identity, pointing to the psychological trauma Pistone experienced and the destruction of his family life as evidence that such operations extracted unacceptable human costs. They noted that Pistone had to witness and participate in criminal activities, including planning for murders, raising questions about whether the evidence gathered justified the moral compromises required. Supporters argued that dismantling organizations like the Mafia required extraordinary measures, that conventional investigations had failed for decades, and that the prosecutions resulting from Pistone's work prevented countless future crimes by removing violent criminals from society. The debate continues in law enforcement circles whenever long-term undercover operations are proposed, with Donnie Brasco serving as both inspiration and cautionary tale. For the FBI, Operation Donnie Brasco validated investments in undercover capabilities and informed the development of training programs, psychological support systems, and operational protocols for managing deep cover agents. The agency recognized that Pistone had essentially operated without adequate support for much of his 6 years undercover, left to navigate complex psychological and operational challenges without the infrastructure that would later become standard. Modern undercover operations include regular psychological evaluations, mandatory breaks from deep cover to prevent identity confusion, and more robust security protocols to protect agents' families. The FBI's Organized Crime Division expanded its undercover capabilities based on Donnie Brasco's success, infiltrating other criminal organizations using similar long-term identity immersion techniques. The personal cost to Pistone remained significant decades after the operation ended. He lived with constant security awareness, knowing that although many of the mobsters he helped convict were dead or imprisoned, organized crime had a long memory, and punishing federal agents who damaged the organization remained a priority. He maintained relationships with few people, always conscious that anyone new in his life might be a threat. He struggled with the moral weight of what he had done to Lefty, acknowledging in interviews that he had genuinely cared about the man even while gathering evidence against him, creating a psychological contradiction that never fully resolved. The identity confusion he experienced, not knowing where Joseph Pistone ended and Donnie Brasco began, required years of counseling to address, and he admitted that even after extensive therapy, he sometimes missed the clarity and purpose of his undercover life despite its dangers. The story of Joseph Pistone and Donnie Brasco endures because it captures fundamental tensions in human experience: the conflict between loyalty and duty, the cost of deception even when used for legitimate purposes, and the question of whether we are defined by our true identities or the roles we perform. Pistone spent 6 years pretending to be someone else so convincingly that he became that person, demonstrating the malleability of identity and the psychological price of sustained deception. He formed genuine relationships based on lies, creating emotional bonds that were simultaneously real and fraudulent, experiencing affection for people he was systematically betraying. The operation's success required him to abandon conventional morality temporarily, participating in criminal activities and witnessing violence that he could have prevented, justified by the belief that these compromises would ultimately serve justice. The photograph of Pistone, taken after his extraction from the undercover operation, shows a man transformed from the clean-cut FBI agent who had begun the operation in 1975. His face carries lines earned from 6 years of stress. His eyes reflect the wariness that came from constant vigilance, and his posture suggests someone who has survived something that marked him permanently. He looks older than his years, worn by the psychological weight of living 2 incompatible lives simultaneously, and knowing that his choices destroyed people who had trusted him. In that photograph, you can see both the victory of a historic law enforcement achievement and the cost of what was required to accomplish it. A reminder that infiltrating evil sometimes requires touching it so closely that the stain never completely washes away. Years after the operation, Pistone was asked during an interview whether he regretted the 6 years he spent as Donnie Brasco, knowing what it cost him personally and what it cost the people who trusted him. He paused for a long time before answering, that silence itself revealing the complexity of his feelings, and finally said that he would do it again, because the alternative was allowing violent criminals to operate without consequence. But he added that he would never claim the cost was insignificant or that the moral trade-offs were simple, acknowledging that some debts can never be fully repaid and some questions have no satisfying answers. His honesty about those contradictions was perhaps his most valuable contribution to law enforcement, the recognition that fighting monsters sometimes requires methods that diminish the people who employ them, and that heroism often looks less glorious and more traumatic than we imagine.